Hello, welcome to the next installment of Learning with Power. Okay, so as I said before, we'll talk about other things more than just history. We'll also talk about baseball and science, different sciences as well. And so in this lecture I would like to sort of change course a little bit from what we had done before, and I would like to talk a little bit about baseball, as well as dedicate this to my father, who passed away on July 1st. And so this is sort of also going to be a tribute to my father as well. That's him in the plane, his plane. And so it's going to be a combination of baseball. We're going to talk about fantasy baseball, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my father. And like I said, this is dedicated to him. And I'm going to give you some previews as well to what the next episodes are going to be about. More science-oriented, I think. Alright, so back to baseball. Okay, so the reason why I'm doing a baseball one now is because we've just gotten out of what's called the All-Star break, and that happens once a year in baseball. There's an All-Star game, and it more or less demarcates the middle of the season. Actually, right now we're about 60% of the way through, but we're roughly halfway. Okay, and so as of the All-Star break, you know, there's certain revelations that have been happening around the league this year. And so I'm not going to go by every team, but basically I'll talk about each division. So in the American League East, I grew up as an Orioles fan myself, personally. It was very hard to be an Orioles fan in recent years. It's a little better this year, finally. And it was, of course, very easy to be an Orioles fan when I was growing up in the late 60s and in the 70s and in the early 80s until I was out of high school. The Orioles were the best team in baseball. So, and then they were not for a long time. So it's good to see them doing well again this year. And as we talk right now, they're only a game behind the Rays, Tampa Bay Rays, who had an amazing, historic start to the season. And so that's something to talk about. And now that we're coming near the trade deadline, the Orioles need to get, obviously, a starter. And they need a key, like a top starter, and they need to just pony up the prospects to get it. And I think they should go after Lucas Giolito. I think he has the most potential for being the most successful at Camden Yards. You need more of a strikeout guy in a place like that, where even with the moved out fences, home runs still fly out pretty well. And he's consistently been that. So that would be my choice. Alright, so the other phenomenon that's been happening is the imbalance of the divisions. And so you've got 5 teams in the Eastern Division that are all over 500 and are all vying for the playoffs, with the worst team in the American League East at the moment being the Yankees, which is a surprise to me. I thought that the Red Sox were not going to be any good. I have to admit that the Yoshida has been a lot better than I expected it would be. But overall, I think that Shane Bloom should be let out the door. But that's another story. Okay. In the Central Division, the best team in the Central Division is still only around 500, and Cleveland is fading. So it's like Minnesota is going to win that division probably by default. And in the Western Division, you have a team like Oakland who is completely divested in their team. They're on a historic pace for losses. And that's not good either. And the surprise in the West has been Texas. And I just see that continuing. I think they're going to be definitely a playoff team. In the National League, the Phillies have started marching their way back, and now there's talk that they may go after Ohtani, because the Angels have actually, who are in the Western Division in the American League, they've been slipping. And the big talk now in baseball is, are we going to trade Ohtani? Are the Angels going to trade Ohtani? And they probably should. And they might, but they're going to ask for a haul, obviously, in return. And the Phillies fans that I've talked to have said, oh, we're going to get Ohtani. where is he going to play? They already have 3 designated hitters that are fighting for at-bats. So they got Schwarber, Castellanos, and Harper, none of whom play the field very well. You're going to add another DH to that mix? You know, I mean, sure, they need the pitching, but where is he going to bat? Right now, he's better batter than he is a pitcher. And we'll get back to Ohtani. So then in the and the Mets, who have a $500 million payroll, are worse than the Pirates. Nobody saw that coming either. But they just have not. The players have underperformed, and that's the bottom line. And that can happen. It's baseball. In the Central, the talk of the National League Central right now is a guy called Elly De La Cruz. And he is an amazing athletic specimen. He sets StatCast records all the time. He just set one for the strongest throw ever by an infielder in the StatCast era. He's got an amazing exit velocity off of his bat. He's got incredible speed. He's just, and most rookies struggle when they first get to the majors. Not this guy. He's hit the ground running, and you know, who knows? He's out of sight, both power and speed combination, and plays infield. So it's a very valuable player. If you have fantasy team, he's long gone. I had trouble getting him on my teams. I got him on 2 teams. At least I got him. To get him in some of the other leagues, I'm in the very busy leagues, and they grabbed him a month ago, or a month before he was even called up. That's hard to do. You know, you really do sacrifice because you have a limited amount of roster space as it is. On Monday or Thursday, it's a light schedule. You need that extra roster spot to plug a guy in to actually give you another home run or 2 RBIs or something, rather than having a blank. So it's hard to have a guy on your bench who isn't even in the majors. But you know, maybe with him I should have made an exception. But it's hard to do that for any rookie because there's all kinds of rookies that have a lot of promise. In fact, the Reds have another one called Christian Encarnacion Strand. Can't stand his name, it's like this long. But they've just called him up, and he's another guy, basically like another De La Cruz. We don't know how good he's going to be because he's just a rookie, but if you have a fantasy team, you should try to get him. He's also an infielder at the moment. And so, okay, so then in the Western Division, the Dodgers are not really playing as well as was hoped. The Giants have been a lot better than I would have expected, and the Padres, who have spent a ton of money on very high-profile players and who are actually getting good performances out of people like Waka and Kim, and you know, guys that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Tatis has been fine. Machado's starting to hit. Snell's been great. Hader's been fantastic. Lights out, but still somehow are losing. Maybe it's Bob Melvin's fault. I don't know. Okay, so that basically covers the league. Let's get back to Ohtani. Now, and then overall I just want to say the big thing for 2023 to me is injuries. And it's made it a very frustrating season as far as fantasy goes because everybody's getting hurt. And all the top players from last year are all hurt this year. So, you know, and people are, you know, the pundits say, oh, there's no more injuries than normal. I beg to differ. And maybe that's true across the board, but I think there's higher injuries to see. There's only, like in fantasy, you only use like the top 200 players. There's 900 players in the league altogether, but you only use like the top 200 in fantasy. And I think there's more significant injuries amongst the top 200 players than I've ever seen before. Why? Could just be bad luck. Okay, so let's go back to Ohtani and then we'll talk about fantasy baseball more. Okay, so people are like, oh, Ohtani is the greatest ever. We've never seen anything like this. What he's doing is unprecedented before in baseball history. Beg to differ. A fellow by the name of Babe Ruth had the same kind of talent that Ohtani did. In 1918, if they would have had a Cy Young Award in those days, Babe Ruth would certainly have won it. But he was such a good hitter that they decided to make him a regular outfielder. Now the difference between Ohtani and Ruth in terms of era is you have the DH now. If you had the DH in 1921, they probably would have had Ruth doing the same thing, DHing and pitching. But you didn't have that as an option. Also, you had a different mentality in those days, is that you had pitchers were a position player. And so you had sort of a rotation that was starting to, they were beginning to have rotations at that time, but you still had pitchers with 300 innings and things like that. And so very hard to be a regular right fielder when you're pitching that much. And you have to take some kind of a break. But by putting Ohtani at DH, they're able to manage his, say, stress levels. So they can give his arm a break while he's at DH, because he's just hitting. If he has to play right field, let's say, which I'm sure Ohtani would be a great right fielder because he's got a great arm, every time he fields a ball, he has to make a throw. So that does not give his arm a break. And you did not have that as an option in Babe Ruth's day. And also, the thing about Babe Ruth is that the leading hitter in the American League for home runs in I think it was in 1919, had 9. And then in 1921, Babe Ruth hits 59. So the level of Babe Ruth was here, everybody else was down here somewhere. Ohtani's not that good. But nobody has done what Ohtani is doing, because he is playing in a different era. So he is actually the Angels' best hitter, and you could argue that he's the best hitter in baseball even. Not to the degree that Ruth was, but you could argue that Ohtani is the best hitter in baseball, and he's also the Angels' best pitcher. And nobody's ever done that, and he's done that now 3 years in a row. He's done that consistently. So the talk is that he's going to get $500 million because he's a free agent at the end of the year, which is why the Angels need to trade him, because with Trout out, that rhymes, they have no chance. So they really should trade Ohtani. But how do you do that? It's a really difficult PR move. Who's worth Ohtani? And so there's a lot of talk that he's probably going to get a $500 million contract. That would be the first ever. In fact, it would blow away the largest contract ever given, because basically he's essentially an ace starter and the league's best hitter in the same player. So you're getting both of those in one player. So if you've got guys making over $300 million contracts, Ohtani should get $500. If you've got a pitcher like Verlander who's making $42 million for this year, Ohtani should be making $50 million. And he's young enough that he could still get like a 10-year contract. So maybe he's going to be a $500 million player. The risk is, because he does pitch and does put a lot of stress on his body, he's been doing it the last 3 years, but when he first came into the league in 2018, he had some trouble doing both. And historically in Japan too, he had some trouble maintaining both. He's been doing it the last 3 years, but he's an injury waiting to happen. I mean, he's a major, major injury risk. And if he has Tommy John surgery, he doesn't pitch for a year and a half. He can still bat, but not as well as he normally would bat. So $500 million is a lot of money. And if that injury comes, you sign him to a $500 million contract, he pitches 3 games next year, and oh yes, has TJ surgery. $500 million. It's a lot of money to spend on one person, and that's the bottom line, is he's one guy. He's a human being. He's one person. And that's a lot of money. So that would be my hesitation. And if I owned a team, as much as I love Ohtani and I love seeing what he's doing, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. Okay, so let's talk about fantasy baseball. So now, I don't know if you play fantasy baseball. I do. I'm backed off on it a little bit, but basically I've played some form of fantasy baseball ever since I was a kid. I think my first year was '76. And that's before they had fantasy baseball with what they call Roto. And that didn't evolve until the early 80s. And in fact, didn't get popular enough until 1990. I actually have the very first Volume 1, Issue number 1 of the very first fantasy baseball magazine, which wasn't published until 1990. And it has Will Clark on the cover. And that was done in April of 1990 to help you pick your teams. And at that time, all we had was Roto. And before there was that kind of Roto fantasy baseball, what you had is what have become called sim leagues. And so you had tabletop baseball. So you had like APBA or Stratomatic or some other brand, and you would roll the dice, and the stats would, would produce results that were very, very similar to what they did in real life. And it would be kind of random because you're rolling the dice, so you could hit 3 home runs in a game, but maybe not hit a home run in the next 10 games. Dice rolls can be random. And today on computers, that's called a sim league. But the more popular is actually fantasy, and actually they're getting away from straight Roto, and they're doing more like points leagues and things. One of the problems with straight Roto is that stolen bases became, when Roto was invented in the 80s, stolen bases were a big thing. They're not anymore, and they haven't really been since the 90s. Another thing that's getting to be really difficult to manage is, since Kevin Cash basically came into the league as a manager, and he's managing his pitching staff differently, and he's been successful, and a lot of other managers are mimicking his management of the pitchers. You don't have pure closers anymore. So your Bobby Thigpens of 1990, you don't really have this year, and you're never going to have again. And so saves have become also less, a lot more difficult. So they're trying to do other things, like they're trying to use holds and things like that, which I think is a dumb idea. And ESPN is completely ruined their format. It's not even playable anymore. It's so bad now. So don't even try ESPN anymore. Come and sue me. I don't care. It's terrible. And I will explain to you why if you want me to. Okay, so fantasy baseball used to be difficult because you had to keep your own stats. And so you're erasing and adding, erasing 3 at-bats today, erasing 4 more at-bats today. And that was the way you had to do stats in the old days. One thing about computers is it has made stat keeping a lot easier. It just does it automatically. And so that helps you keep track of your fantasy teams a lot better now. And the first online fantasy games, I think, was 2002, which is when Yahoo started. And if you look at Yahoo, it's really clunky. They still haven't really revised their site, but it's serviceable. But you can see that it's mostly oriented toward football, because that's really what people do with fantasy. Fantasy baseball, and not so big. Fantasy football is literally twice as popular, 2 times as popular as fantasy baseball, just to show you what football, how that has exploded. And basketball is like maybe almost equal at baseball now. And then there's hockey. They have soccer fantasy sites, which I haven't played, and I'm not even sure how they work. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about, well, sort of the next to last thing, is my father. My father's name is George Porter Houston Jr., and he really was a great man. And actually, we come from kind of a pretty celebrated, I don't know, celebrated, accomplished, I guess, family. We're not millionaires who live in Newport, Rhode Island, but we have had our fair share of successful or famous ancestors. And my father's no different. And the first George Porter Houston was a Civil War hero, and he wound up becoming very good friends with John Philip Sousa, and he's depicted in the movie Stars and Stripes Forever in 1951, and he's played by a guy named Roy Roberts. And also we are just directly descended from John Paul Jones on my grandmom's side, his mother's side. There's that on my dad's side. On my mom's side, actually, it's a whole other story. We're actually descended from Charlemagne, and I can prove that too. So there's a lot of people in our family that were very, very... And also, there's Sam Houston, who's sort of like a great uncle. Anyway, so my grandfather was an electrical engineer, and so was my father, and so was my uncle. They graduated from Hopkins. My dad graduated from Maryland, and they were very brilliant engineers. And my father got at least 1 patent in his own name. That was his patent, but he helped develop many others. And he had significant contributions to parimutuels, either racetracks or lotteries around the country at Amtote. And before that, he was at Bendix for 9 years, and he was involved in a lot of projects. Now, in the mid-70s, my grandfather resurrected the Swift, which is that plane there. And you might see a picture of my grandfather with the Swift. He purchased it in 1947 originally. The Swift is from 1946. It's the first year that they made the Globe Swift. It was made in Texas. And they're very rare. There's only about 500 of them in the world anymore. And there's actually a bunch of them in France now, for whatever reason. But the Swift became my father's passion starting in the mid-70s. Before that, he had fast motorcycles and he had fast cars. He had a 69 Z28 Camaro, and he had fast boats, and he was a great water skier, a really well gifted water skier, but he had to give that up to buy a house for me and my mom and in Perry Hall, Maryland. And then my mother divorced him, and then he had to move. We moved from Perry Hall, and I moved to Towson. So I guess along the way you'll pick up tidbits of my life story, which may or may not interest you. But I'm talking about my dad here. So my father then married this woman named Sue Carol Hoffman, and they were married for 41 years. And they built a place in Hunt Valley, Maryland, which is a really beautiful place. And they had a really great relationship, and they went on several trips. And my dad traveled a lot too. Now, my grandfather traveled extensively, and that's why actually from about the mid-50s to about the mid-70s, till 1974, the plane was in storage, because my grandfather during that time was doing extensive traveling, mostly for Page Electronics. He was going to Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia and Australia. He designed the satellite system that linked Australia to the rest of the world, and he was declared like a national hero in the headlines in Australian newspapers. When I went to Australia for the first time, they said, "What do you plan to do here?" I said, "Well, the last family member that came here left as a national hero. If I could do anything, any percentage of that, I'd be doing well." Of course I didn't. But he had a lot of achievements with his hobbies and professionally, and also in building a beautiful home with a great wife. And so that was my father, and I'll miss him very much. Dad, it's to you. And so that's my father, and I was very, very proud of him. Okay, so last thing I'm going to do is talk about the previews to what I'm going to do next episodes. And so the next episode I'm going to talk about what's called what I call the rule of evolution. It's not the theory of evolution, it's something completely different, and something that you will not hear anywhere else, that nobody else has ever written about or published a paper on. You will not hear it anywhere else but from right here. And that's called the rule of evolution, and I believe it's true. And if you listen, you might realize it's probably true also. Okay, so that's the next episode. The episode after that, I'm going to talk about linguistics, and I'm going to compare Asian languages and European languages and sort of the origins of both and how they evolved to be different from each other, distinctly different, and what are the differences. And then the next episode, 3 episodes hence, I'm going to talk about economics. And I'm going to try to explain economics in a much more clear way, and I'm going to focus on the fact that the US dollar is the world reserve currency. And that's a very important distinction that most people don't really take in consideration when they're posting all of these, Facebook things, and the dollar's going to do this, and da-da-da-da, and we're going to have Armageddon, and the debt, you can't have a debt, and blah, 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 and that's not how you run a business. None of that takes in consideration the fact that the US dollar is the world reserve currency. And I will explain the significance of that and why that's so important in general macroeconomics, not microeconomics, but macroeconomics as well. And that will be the 3rd episode hence. All right. And I hope that you'll be with us for those exciting episodes. Again, you're only going to hear that right here on Learning with Power. And until the next time, I'm Scott Powers Houston. We'll see you then. Have a good